What's up guys, Brian Pinamonti with Pinamonti Physical Therapy and Wellness Center. Today we're going to continue our series on functional movement with an emphasis on hip mobility. Our society has become sedentary with a lot of sitting jobs, driving, watching sporting events, watching our phones, and we don't realize how tight our hips are getting. So today we're going to address some hip mobility issues which will help alleviate some of your lower back pain, potentially hip pain, knee and ankle pain. If you have tightness in your hip girdle, that can affect the joints above and below your hips. So if you're having lower back pain or upper thoracic pain, that can all stem from limited mobility in your hips. So today, we're going to show you some exercise to free up those hips, improve your hip mobility, and that will also help lower back stability, knee stability, and ankle stability. So when we're talking about hip mobility, some of you may go, what the heck's hip mobility? Well, the hip is a multi-planar joint just like the shoulder. So that means it moves in multiple planes. When we talk about hip mobility, we're talking about hip flexion, we're talking about hip extension, we're talking about hip abduction, hip adduction. Then you also have the rotational components, external and internal. So when we talk about hip mobility, it's making sure that your hip moves freely in all those patterns, because if you have a restriction in one of those patterns, that's going to limit how you move, whether you're walking, running, standing, sitting. If you have a limitation in hip mobility, it's going to place stress on other joints above and below your hip, lower back, knees, ankles, upper thoracic spine. So hip mobility is critical for movement, especially as we age. Not going to bore you with all the anatomy and physiology. If you want to see that stuff, there's plenty of resources on the internet, but we're just going to talk about hip mobility and some exercises that you can do to free that up today. All right, so the first exercise I'm going to show you is a forward fold. It's also a standing hamstring stretch. We call it a forward fold because we're including our lower back into that a little bit. Most of us are sitting all day, driving around, so you're going to get tightness in the back of your hamstrings, and that puts a lot of stress on your pelvic girdle, which also stresses your lumbar spine. So that first stretch is a hamstring stretch or forward fold. You should be able to touch your toes without any warm-up. So if you're having trouble touching your toes with just a forward fold, you really need to focus on stretching those hamstrings out, because that's going to limit not only your hip mobility, but it's also going to limit your lower back and put a lot of stress on your lumbar spine. Forward fold. Now from here, you should be able to touch your toes or the floor without any problem. A lot of times we will also have some big toe stiffness where it will not extend. That will limit some of your mobility with walking and running. So when I do the forward fold and I stretch my hamstrings, a lot of times I'll grab my big toe and I'll just try to pull it up to free it up, making sure I get some of that extension in the big toe, so when I'm running or walking, I can really have good toe extension and I'm not limiting my pattern of mobility there as well. You've seen me demonstrate this move before. This is a functional squat position. If you're not getting in this position daily, I would highly recommend spending a few minutes a day in this functional squat position. Whether it's a couple seconds, it doesn't matter, but just getting into this is going to open up your hip girdle a little bit. Also take some stress off of your lower back. You can also feel how your feet and your toes are hitting the ground, and you can kind of settle into that. If you're having trouble getting into that, make sure you use a chair or a countertop to help you achieve that position. But getting into this will really open up the hip girdle. And from here, you can do some movement patterns to kind of stretch your groin or your adductor muscles. And then from here, I like to drop into a little bit of an internal rotation on each hip a little bit. You can free that up, come back up into a standing position, free your legs up, kind of stretch out your hips, and then come back into that functional squat. The more you can attain this position comfortably, the more freedom your hips are going to have in your rotational movement patterns, external and internal rotation, as well as improves your ankle and knee motion as well. The next position is a hip and knee 90-90. Some people call it a pigeon. It's kind of a yoga pose, but you're going to get your hips and knees at a 90-degree angle, and you can lean forward You should feel a nice stretch in your glutes or your buttocks. And if you're having trouble getting into that external rotation here, you can always use a pillow or something to elevate your bottom. But you're just going to lean in and hold that stretch. You can twist each way. Now, the length of time I like to hold stretches, and I should have told you this earlier, is at least 30 seconds. But the older that you get, hold that length of stretch for your age in seconds. So if you're 40 or 50, hold it for 40 seconds or 50 seconds. The older you get, keep holding it for your age, because you're going to be a little bit more stiff, a little tighter. The more you can elongate that muscle tissue is going to help free up that hip and hip girdle for more mobility. So we're obviously doing our right side here for external. Then you can lean back and you're going to put a little stretch on your back leg. Now when we want to flip and do the other side, just windshield wiper your legs. Hold that stretch and then come back. So this is the hip 90-90. So you're just working that mobility back and forth. All right, so our last position that we're going to do is in a half kneeling stretch to stretch our hip flexors. If we're sitting a lot, we not only tighten our hamstrings from being in a seated position all day, but our hip flexors will get tight as well. So we need to stretch those out so that takes stress off of our hip girdle and our lumbar spine as well. So you can get in a half kneeling position. Now, if you have big toe stiffness, you can work some of that out by tucking your toes underneath you. And you're just going to lean forward and you should feel a nice stretch up your quad and into your hip flexor. Once again, you're going to hold that stretch for your age in seconds. And you're going to repeat that on both sides. So you're just going to lean in and kind of throw your chest and shoulders backwards. So you should feel a nice stretch up the front of your abdominal region and into your hip flexors. If it bugs your big toe, point them and work into that stretch. That's your final exercise of the day to help free up your hip girdle and improve hip mobility. So that's the hip mobility routine that'll help free up some of your hips if you have hip girdle tightness. Now remember, mobility of your hip or any joint precedes stability. So if you have some limitations in hip mobility that don't feel right, make sure you go see a physical therapist or a physiatrist or somebody that can help you free up those hips professionally. But remember, it's not going to happen overnight. These things take time, so be patient, stretch daily, get into some of these positions, because if you do sit down all day or you drive a lot, you're going to have tightness, and stretching for a couple minutes a day is not going to fix that if you're only doing it for a little bit. So you should really think about how you can improve your functional mobility throughout the day by doing some of these stretching exercises. Remember, life is a marathon. It's not a sprint, so it takes time. Appreciate you watching. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, hit that like, leave us a comment of things that you'd like to say. We hope this helps you improve your hip mobility so that you have better movement, because remember, your health matters and movement's life.